Hi, my name is Asger Kjærum. I'm the Advocacy Director at the International Rehabilitation Council for torture victims. And I'm here today to answer some of your questions about the global fight against torture and the IRCT's specific role in those efforts. Torture is the intentional infliction of severe psychological or physical pain and suffering by a government official, intentional and for a series of different purposes. It can be obtaining information, punishment, discrimination, etc. It can happen to a person who goes into a prison in Mexico. It can happen to somebody who goes to protest in the streets in France, who gets shot in the face with rubber bullets or tear gas canisters. It can happen to a poor person in Nigeria who is framed for a crime the person didn't commit. It can happen to an LGBTI person simply because of who they are. It can happen to a woman in the context of conflict and so on. So really it can happen to anybody. And the big problem, and one of the reasons why it continues to exist, is first that we don't acknowledge that it can happen to anybody. Rather, we think that it can only happen to people that we find it very difficult to empathize with. It's important to understand that torture can both be a physical act, so it can be a beating or electrocution and so on, but it can also be things that actually do not even touch you. For example, being put in solitary confinement or being put in other forms of isolation where you don't have access to daylight and so on. Both those acts or omissions have both physical and psychological consequences. It is long-term and usually persists if people are not supported with rehabilitation and reparation. First, it's important to understand that torture is not something that you overcome or that you move past. It's something that you learn to live with. One of the most essential elements in recovery is that we need to understand that the defining element in being tortured is that you are being rendered powerless. So you're being put in a situation where you're unable to defend yourself, you're unable to avoid these cruel things that somebody else is doing to you. When we want to help people go on a healing journey, one of the most essential elements is that we enable and help people to re-empower themselves, to take control over their own life. We do that for a number of different reasons, but they are all linked to the idea of justice and reparation. When we talk about justice, we are not just talking about a criminal trial where a perpetrator is sent to prison. The essence of torture in almost all countries that we see is that the authorities deny that it's taking place, so that when you have been tortured, you are put in a situation where people think that you're lying. So actually justice doesn't start with a criminal trial, it starts with simply establishing the truth. And forensic evidence can be a very effective tool to establish beyond doubt what has happened to the person. When we collect evidence from torture survivors, we try to collect evidence both of the physical trauma that people have suffered and the psychological trauma that people have suffered. So one of the first challenges is that because torture survivors often are only able to disclose what happened to them much later than when the acts took place, much of the physical symptoms that one would have been able to detect and photograph and document are simply gone. That doesn't mean that one cannot still find physical symptoms, but it becomes a lot more complex to document. A second element is ensuring the safety of victims and survivors throughout the documentation process, and that the act of documenting what happened to them does not put them at risk of further torture or other forms of punishment. When we document, ideally we should also have a sense of what we are documenting for, so that we are not over-documenting, because the process of documentation is very, very hard for most survivors. So it also needs to be done in a way where we have a realistic idea that what we document and the level of evidence we are creating will actually be helpful and useful for them and the fight against torture in the future. When the IRCT started our work several decades ago, the way that torture was understood, and most of the victims that were supported were people who were being exposed to political oppression. So you can think about the dictatorships in Latin America, for example, where a lot of left-wing, politically active persons were very brutally tortured. Today, the vast majority of torture victims are not being tortured because they're politically active. They're being tortured because they are different. So because they are women, because they are LGBTI persons, because they are indigenous people and so on. They may be tortured simply because they are poor. So you see in many countries that the police will actually solve crime by simply going into poor areas and finding somebody that they look like they can frame as a criminal, and then they will torture the person to confess to the crime that has been committed, and thereby their job is done. So the face of torture and the reasons why people are being tortured are changing, and that also forces us to change with it, because as anti-torture organizations, we no longer only think about how can we then help people and how can we fight torture in the context of political oppression. We need to think about how can we do our work in the context of discrimination. How can we do our work in the context of criminal justice processes? First of all, we provide rehabilitation support to survivors, more than 70,000 survivors in 2023, so that we can help them rebuild their lives and again live a meaningful life with their families, with their communities, and in broader society. Second, we document torture both forensically and through other means, so that we can help victims establish the truth about what happened to them, and eventually, hopefully, use this evidence in different legal or administrative processes. But actually, most importantly, just to enable victims to clearly establish that they are victims and not criminals. Third, we also work more broadly to advocate for reparations to victims. And as part of that, we are helping victims to speak out publicly about what happened to them. We're helping victims to access decision makers both in their own countries, at the regional and global level, so that their voices can be heard and their demands for justice and reparation can be understood and become part of global political discussion. Torture can never be okay. It doesn't matter who the victim is. It doesn't matter if it is a terrorist or a criminal or somebody who was simply framed as a terrorist or a criminal or any kind of other person. Torture is not okay if it happens to your worst enemy. And if we understand that, and we understand the severe human devastation that torture causes, not only individual, but in the family of the person, in the community of the person, we should also be in a place where we will never accept that it happens. Remember that nobody deserves to be tortured, and understand how frequent it still is. That, for me, should be a good basis for everyone to think differently and act differently about this issue.